Abdu, thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation today.
Oh, I am too, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Saving Truth, it's your brand new book. It's such a provocative title, and it really informs me of the fact that truth may have been hijacked. What was your heart behind the book? Why did you write it? Give us a temperature reading on what's happening in culture.
Sure, and the title actually was meant to be an eye-catcher, obviously, to capture two things, actually, a double entendre, if you will. The first thing, the idea is that I think truth has been, to some degree, either hijacked or the value of it has been lost. In 2016, Oxford English dictionaries, as they always do every year, they named their word of the year. And at the end of 2016, the word of the year was post-truth. And a post-truth culture, as defined by Oxford English dictionaries, essentially is one that elevates feelings and preferences over facts and truth. Or the way they put it is, a post-truth culture is one in which appeals to emotion and personal preferences shape opinion more than appeals to facts and truth. So we're basically taking human preferences, all the things we wish were true, or the things we care about, and saying if truth is on our side, great. If it's not, we're going to either lie about it, or we're just going to ignore it altogether. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is to say, this is what's happening culturally. How can we actually engage with a post-truth culture, but also how can we lead them to a saving truth? And so how do we save truth from a culture that doesn't want it, but how can we do that in a way that leads them to a saving truth, specifically, I think, the truths that are found in the gospel?
That's really good. I want to tee you up on maybe one of the first points you made in the book. And in the book, you said that, in a way, we've made truth subordinate to personal preference. Could you expand?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what's happened. You know, in a postmodern culture, and one of the things that I think we often think about is that we're in a postmodern culture where there are no objective truths, everything is relative. And we were in that mindset for a while, but I think we've largely come out of that. But we haven't come out of it to a truth-centered culture. We went from postmodernism to post-truth. Now they look very similar, but they're not the same. See, a postmodern culture says that there are no objective truths. What's true for you is true for you, and that's subjectively your opinion. Well, what's true for me is true for me, but don't try to foist your objective truths, if there are any such things, on me, because that'd be a power move. Everything's subjective. You can reason with a postmodern person, because when they say something like, there's no such thing as objective truth, all you have to do is ask them the question, is that statement you just said objectively true? And if the statement is objectively true, then there are truths, in which case their worldview is false. But if the statement isn't true, it's only subjectively true, then why should I believe it? Because it's not actually true. So why'd you say anything in the first place? That's the kind of thing you can have with a postmodern person. And I've seen it happen where people actually come out of a postmodern mindset, seeing the self-contradiction within it. A post-truth culture is different. A post-truth culture doesn't reject objective truth. It says there is an objective truth, but my feelings and preferences matter more. So basically they say there is truth, but I don't care. It's a little bit, I would even say, more difficult to deal with a post-truth culture, because reason and logic don't actually factor into the discussions. Now, that isn't to say that people walk around saying, I'm a post-truth person. No one says I'm post-truth, I don't care about truth, because you sound like a crazy person if you say something like that. What they end up doing is functional. They actually will lie about things, which is the hard mode of a post-truth culture, or the soft mode is even worse. They won't lie about truth, just ignore it. So, for example, there are certain behaviors and ideas that are actually extremely harmful to humanity. We know this, scientifically we know it. But because we're given to our preferences and we want to validate feelings more than we want to actually conform our feelings to the truth, we'll ignore all that science that says that certain behavior is just detrimental, not only to a person, but society as a whole. So facts and truth don't matter, but preferences matter more. Part of that is because there is a well-meaning intention here. We want to say, look, people are valuable, they have inherent dignity, we want to validate their preferences. But the reality is certain preferences are just bad. They're just bad for the people, they're bad for all of us. And I think that leads also to chaos.
Yeah, and let's unpack that. We live in such a chaotic, frenetic society.
Indeed.
You describe in the book a culture of confusion. And I love the analogy that you presented about moving objects. Could you kind of dive into that a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, and the example I give is a few years ago I was doing a speaking engagement and I had to cross the Detroit River. I was going into Canada in a town called Wahllsburg. And in order to cross there, you go to Algonac, Michigan, and there's this ferry. a car ferry. Now, all of us from the Great Lakes state,
Sure.
when we think of car ferry, we think of these 30 car carrying boats. This was not one of those. This thing could fit 2 cars, and it looked like Lord of the Rings style, honestly. I was waiting for the guy to pull me across the river with a rope. It was this rickety thing. But I got on this car ferry, and I'm terrible with directions, so I looked down at my GPS just to make sure that I'm going to the right place when I cross the border. Well, it's at that moment that we leave the dock. So I didn't see us leave, I didn't feel us leave because I was in the car. And so, in other words, all the energy from the leaving was absorbed by the suspension of the car and the mass. So I couldn't see us leave and I couldn't feel us leave. So when I looked up, I was in this disoriented state because I had that feeling you have, when you're sitting at a street light or you're at a corner somewhere, there's a bus next to you and the bus goes forward and you don't know if you're going backward at that particular moment. Well, in that particular moment, what you do is you look for a fixed position. You look for a fixed point of reference, a mailbox, a street light, a building, to see if you're moving relative to something that's fixed. And if you can see that, now all the confusion and the nausea sort of goes away, and the panic too. Well, I was on a river. Everything is moving, so everything was moving relative to everything else. So there were no fixed positions that were readily accessible to me, except for the distant shore. It's when I saw the distant shore, that's when I began to get my bearings back. So I think our culture today, a culture of confusion, is one that likes being in the river. We don't want to be at the intersection where some parts move, but there are fixed points of reference. We don't want that anymore. We want all things to be moving all the time because we have the freedom now. I wouldn't even say it's freedom. I would say it's autonomy.
Yes.
Which is the ability to do whatever you want because there are no fixed positions by which you judge your actions and your preferences. That's what I mean by a culture of confusion. We're in a culture that actually embraces confusion as a virtue and declines clarity as if it was sinful. And why? Because confusion allows there to be no bright lines. Everything's fuzzy.
Right.
We have moral demarcations, behavioral demarcations, but they're all fuzzy lines. So we can approach them, we can play with them, we can move them out if we want to, because we want to give full vent to our preferences. But if there's clarity, then we've crossed a fence. Then we've moved over a border. And now we have to actually judge our own actions, even self-judge, by where we are next to the unmovable. And we're not comfortable with that anymore. We don't want to be judged by standards. We want to have our own standards and become laws unto ourselves.
We're going to dive into this as we get further into the conversation, but I'd love to just nail this thing on the head in simple fashion. What are the consequences of living life in that way?
Well, the first consequence, there's actually a couple of consequences, and I think this is an important way to actually, I started off saying, how do you actually talk about truth with someone who doesn't care?
Right.
And I think the way nowadays, there's a fascination now with pragmatism. Do what works. What is true is what works. Of course, that's fallacious, that's logically silly.
Right.
It might work because it's true, but it's not true because it works. But our culture is fascinated with the idea of pragmatism. So one of the ways to approach a post-truth culture is to point out the consequences of living post-truth. There are 3 actual, I think, main consequences to this whole thing. I think the first thing we lose is our sense of reason. We lose all ability to reason. And we see this actually, ironically, in the places where reason is supposed to be the guiding principle, universities. This is where we see it. So I think we lose our ability to reason. I mean, if you think about it, when I'm a law unto myself, and you're a law unto yourself, because we're not free, we're autonomous, and I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Sure.
That means that my preferences need to be given full vent, and if you don't do it, you're intolerant. Now, if you have your preferences and I don't do it, then I'm intolerant. But here's the problem. What if your preferences and my preferences conflict? And if truth isn't the arbiter, isn't the determiner of who's right and wrong, who's going to decide between us? One of us can be right, one of us can be wrong, or maybe we're both wrong. But it's not going to be truth that helps to determine that. It's going to be power. And that leads to the certainties of chaos, I think. So, example, lack of reason.
Sure.
I was talking to somebody about different religious views, and this person was basically saying, there is an objective truth out there, but we don't know all of it yet. And I'm like, okay, I agree with that. If I knew everything, I'd be God. I'm certainly not God. So far, you and I agree that I'm not God. He said, but we're all trying to get there. So all of us have incomplete versions of the truth. So I asked him for the probing question. All of us? And he said, yeah, all of us. I said, like Mao Zedong, Hitler, Pol Pot, Stalin, Fidel Castro, You name your despot and you ask me, does that person have an incomplete version of the truth? His statement to me was this. He says, I can tell you I don't prefer their version of the truth, but I can't disagree with it because I don't have a complete version of the truth myself. So I asked him, I said, are you telling me you can't disagree with anybody? He said, that's right. I said, sure you can. He said, no, I can't. I said, you just did it. He just disagreed with me about his inability to disagree with people. So an otherwise extremely intelligent man, by the way, was willing to sacrifice reason on the altar of his preferences. And his preference was we all just get along and don't do the hard work of engaging in what I call the dignity of difference, dialoguing with each other and taking each other's differences seriously. He didn't want to do that, so he sacrificed reason. And we've seen this in other places too. Universities, my goodness. There was that incident in 2015, I believe it was, when a journalism professor or a professor of communications tied with a journalism school actually got into the face of a journalist at a public protest on racial issues that were happening on a university, and she wanted to get him forcibly removed because he had violated a safe space. How confused of a culture do you have to be where someone who teaches communication in connection with a journalism school is violating the First Amendment freedom of the press rights of a journalist at a public university? So I think that's one of the consequences, is this lack of ability to reason. The second consequence is that we lose all sense of accountability. And that's very, very dangerous, extremely dangerous. It's that freedom versus autonomy thing. You know, we've taken this word freedom and we worship freedom as if it were sort of like the cardinal virtue or almost godlike in the United States. And of course, freedom is very important, but we've worshipped it so much that we've morphed it into a different thing. Freedom used to have limits, because freedom necessarily has to have limits. Autonomy is what we're actually looking for. We don't want freedom, we want autonomy. Autonomy is the ability to do, be, and say whatever you want, however you want, whenever you want. That's not freedom. That's just a license for chaos.
Sure.
And that's what we want. We want autonomy. Protagoras said it centuries ago when he said, man is the measure of all things. We're saying it today. We are the measure of all things. We are the determiners of truth. We are the determiners of fact. I can be and say and do whatever I want, whenever I want. Well, that leads to no accountability, because if I'm the determiner of truth, who am I accountable to? Well, no one. And that's going to lead to the Hitlerization, I call it, of social commentary, where if someone doesn't agree with me, they're automatically Hitler or Stalin or Pol Pot. Pick your, sort of paradigmatic, awful person, and I'm going to call you that if you don't agree with me, because we're no longer accountable. Because how dare you disagree with me? I'm God after all, that kind of thing. It was an atheist named Yuval Harari who actually pointed out that human beings, he's got a book out, I believe it's called Deus Homo, about the God-man, is that we are actually elevating ourselves to God-like status. And he says, we are petty gods who don't know what we want. Is there anything more dangerous? So lack of reason, lack of accountability, and that leads to a lack of a sense of human value, because certain people just get in my way because of their belief systems or because of their behaviors or whatever it is. And so we use the power we have to just run over them. And we lack an ability to actually look at someone who disagrees with us fundamentally and say, though you disagree with us, or with me in particular, I still see you as an inherently valuable human being. We've lost that ability, which is why we're so polarized today.
Let's take that and expound upon that. Let's spring off that, because I think one of the challenges for us as disciples of Jesus, and even this book is written by you as a disciple of Jesus. One of the things and one of the challenges I think is facing Christians today is to not weaponize a message like this, to not objectify a message like that, and then it creates an us versus them dynamic. How have we as disciples of Jesus really contributed to this culture of confusion?
Boy, I'll tell you, that's incredibly important, and in fact in chapter 2, that's what I go into. It's a time for self-reflection. Because the way you put it, weaponizing this kind of approach, it can happen. The post-truth culture is something that has actually infected everybody. There is none immune, no, not one, honestly. I remember in 2015, after the Obergefell decision happened, where the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. I got all these social media tweets or whatever it was that coming on my feeds, and then emails from people saying, well, that didn't take long. Activists are trying to ban the Bible now in federal court. They're using the Obergefell decision to justify their positions. So I looked it up. I did some research, and yeah, a guy did actually sue 2 Christian publishers about their versions of the Bible related to same-sex behavior. But he wasn't seeking to ban the thing. He was seeking emotional damages because he thought that their mistranslation of it invalidated him as a person somehow. Well, that case got thrown out and dismissed as frivolous. But here's the kicker. It wasn't filed after the Supreme Court decision. It was filed 7 years before. And Christians, I'm sad to say, were the ones who were propagating this false narrative about them.
Yep.
They're evil and
Yes.
they're awful and they're trying to get us, come after us. Now look, is there an agenda? Yeah, there is. But I think we run the risk of vilifying people and failing to see something, especially as Christians. We have to remember something. We were once them, and in some ways we still are.
Wow.
If we're sinners saved by grace,
Yeah.
then we have to recognize they are just us, but we happen to have found a Savior who's not us. So the last person who should take pride in their own righteousness is a Christian.
Yeah.
Yet, I think we do. And then we weaponize these issues, and then we actually succumb to what a post-truth culture does. The post-truth culture Hitlerizes somebody else, and so we start doing it too. Well, the fact of the matter is, we are in and not of the culture. We're supposed to be that way, but the reality is, I think, we're not taking Jesus as our teacher oftentimes. We're using the culture and letting them be our guide and acting like the broader culture. And it just shouldn't be so.
Yeah, and I see that happening. There's this arm of progressive Christianity happening today, and I'm not quite convinced that their goal is to seek truth, but to be widely accepted by a culture. Let's dive into this further. What do you have to say about that? And how do we really tackle that really important issue?
Well, that's the pendular swing, isn't it? You go from one extreme where you villainize those who oppose the gospel, and or at least seem to oppose the gospel, and I think people are specifically opposing it. And then you pendular swing all the way over to affirming everything that they say, want, or do. One of the manifestations of this is reinterpreting Bible verses, for example, that have very clear demarcations on certain moral behavior, certain sexual behaviors.
Right.
And you reinterpret them because, well, you know somebody, or I don't want to be disliked. I want to make the gospel more palatable to a broader audience. Well, you're never told to do that. You're told to act more palatable, but not edit the gospel. It's to proclaim, not to edit. But like, for example, the judge not lest ye be judged, Matthew chapter 7. People often misuse, this is probably the single most misused verse of the Bible in the Western society at all. Do not judge. Well, that's not what it says. It says don't judge hypocritically, but when you do judge, judge correctly. So we are called to judge, but not self-hypocritically. So you can see right there, in that one statement, Jesus addresses both polar opposites, where you judge hyper-religiously or self-righteously, or you don't judge at all. He's not saying, he's saying don't do this or that, go right in the middle. Judge yourself first, then use that same standard to judge others. That's the key. But the church, I think, sometimes either wants to vilify people or make everybody their buddy. And you just simply can't effectuate change that way. The church has never changed a culture positively by doing either one of those two things.
And Jesus stood right in the middle of that, and it makes me think, there are two ends of the spectrum, and I just kind of want to be redundant to what you're saying for emphasis, but we have this religious spirit that, John 5, we bludgeon people with the word of God. And then on the other side is the political spirit where Pilate, like with Jesus, he washed his hands of it, and then we say, whatever works for you, that's fine. But Jesus stood in the middle. In fact, Jesus was known as friend of sinners, and he was accused of all of those lifestyle choices, and wrongly so. But Abdu, one of the things he was so successful at is reaching people who needed a savior. So my question is, what was it about his approach that modern disciples of Jesus need to adopt to say, there's a better way to evangelize, to bring truth? Because there was a purity about Jesus, authenticity that attracted people. I'd just love to know your thoughts about that.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the things that convicted me to become a Christian in the first place, was the way in which he addressed sin uncompromisingly, but he addressed it invitingly, which is very hard to do. But if you look at the way he does it, I think it's important. The Apostle Paul talks about this specifically in Colossians chapter 4. verses 5 and 6. In fact, I actually model my ministry based on those words. When he says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. In other words, talk about what they care about, but address it in a gospel-centered way. Don't answer questions no one's asking. And then he says, let your speech be gracious as though seasoned with salt, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. That last word, that's not accidental. He didn't say how you ought to answer each question, each objection, each political issue, each social upheaval, how you ought to answer each person. You specifically answer people. I speak at university forums all over the place, and thousands sometimes come to these things and they line up, and it's usually skeptics who line up at the microphones. Yeah. I think one of the distinctions about how we're able to go down campuses that historically, or at least recently, haven't been inviting to the Christian message or a conservative message is because of the way we give it. When you look at Ravi, when you look at me, Vince Vitale, other people on our speaking team who are just really, really great at this, they validate the questioner and say, your question is important because you asked it. Not because the question is academically curious, but because you asked it. So I want to address you as a person. That's what Paul is saying. We're not in the question, controversy, or issue answering business. We ought to know how we ought to answer each person.
That's so good.
We have to answer people, because people need answers. Questions don't need answers, but people do. And they use their questions to get them. I think when you do that as a Christian, and you say, no matter who is yelling at me, no matter who is disagreeing with me, that person is made in God's image. That's what we see in Genesis. No matter who they are, they're made in God's image. How dare I, as a Christian, somehow think that person's less than me? We just can't do it. I also can't also have the other side and say, because they're made in God's image, everything they say is valid. That can't be true either. Jesus lovingly pointed out flaws in logic and thinking, but also validated the value of every person. We know with the woman caught in adultery, he says, neither do I judge thee, but go and sin no more. He didn't say, and live the life you've always wanted.
Right.
So I think that's, he was compassionate to her, but he also said, your actions are they're not good for you, but they're also against God. So somehow he managed to do both. If we just emulate the life of Jesus and take those words of Apostle Paul, I think we can do it.
That's really good. Abdu, the first person I believe I need to turn truth towards is myself. So I'd love to know, where does self-awareness fit into this? I think one of the greatest leadership lessons I've ever learned, and I try to coach people through, is being self-aware. So where does self-awareness fit into your book, the message of the book, and how can we become more self-aware through this message of truth?
I have a colleague, his name is Christian Hofreiter. He's in our office in Austria. He was giving a message, and he said, if you think Jesus' parables apply to anybody but you, you missed the point. Yeah. I think oftentimes when we see these things like who is the man's neighbor, or was the Samaritan, or who is this, and the parable of the talents, and you have somebody who didn't invest it well or didn't take care of the treasure, you think, oh, that's somebody else I know. Christian Hofreiter's admonition was, whenever you see a parable of Jesus, assume you're the worst character in it. Oh my gosh. And see how it applies to you. I think that really, really helps us to see, do these things apply to me? And one of the things I think we do, and it wasn't my idea actually, it was an author I cited in the book who was talking about even reaching out to people who are same-sex attracted and all this. She said, Christians often, when they set up a heterosexual, homosexual distinction. And functionally, yeah, there is one. Sure. But if you use heterosexuality as the moral standard, then suddenly you become more moral than everybody else. And so you stop reaching out and you start reaching down. And the goal, I think, for example, with sexuality, isn't a heterosexual lifestyle or a homosexual lifestyle. It's a holy sexual lifestyle. As Christopher Yuan himself, someone who struggles with same-sex attractions, he said, I'm not looking to be sexually normal. I want to be sexually moral. And I think when Christians realize, how often are you sexually immoral, even though you're heterosexual?
Oh, man.
It's not a label that suddenly makes you suddenly moral. Self-reflection helps there. Sure. It really does. So before we start judging other people for their actions, as Jesus would say, judge correctly, maybe we should close down our porn browsers. Maybe we, I even say it in the book, clearing your browser history does not clear your conscience. So be self-reflective.
Yeah. Well, let's stay here, and I do want to dive into some really tactical subjects and approach these practically, Abdu, I have gay friends. And I know a lot of our listeners today associate with homosexual people and may have opinions about that. I love them very much. I don't support the lifestyle at all.
Right.
So tactically, walk us through, how do we navigate this thing of being relentless in our commitment to people, but unwavering in our commitment to the Word and as disciples of Jesus? How do we navigate this?
And I think that's exactly the baseline there, is that recognition of the fundamental truth of human dignity.
Yes.
Human dignity is not a function of preferences. It simply can't be. It cannot be. Because my preferences might be different, someone else's preferences. It can't be that. It's got to be an objective standard. And I think only the Christian faith offers that objective standard. I remember, and this is a story I give in the book as well, when a young lady came up to a microphone at an open forum that we were talking about. We weren't even talking about sexuality. We were talking about different religious systems. And her question was, I've looked at different worldviews and different systems of belief. What does Christianity have to say different, or if it does at all, about sexuality? And she meant her own homosexuality. You approach that microphone and you think to yourself, what am I going to say next? Because this is somebody who's got a sincere question about it.
For sure.
And the first thing I think you do in that particular instance is validate the value of that human being, no matter what their proclivities or preferences or passions are. Just like I would do with anybody else. If someone came to me and said, I have this unbiblical view of things, maybe I'm given to gossip or lying or whatever it might be, or my own self-righteousness, my own identity. And I know of where I speak because I was hyper-religious. I loved the fact that I was, Mr. Religious before. If someone were to approach me and say, you're a Pharisee, I would shut out, immediately shut out, as opposed to saying, God wants more for you. I think that's the approach here, is that if you look at someone and say, the reason why the Bible has these boundaries on sexuality is not arbitrary. I think that's the big issue. You think about someone, I have two colleagues who are same-sex attracted. They've given it to the Lord, 100% submitted it to Christ. Wow. And they say, I still have these. God has not taken them from me, but I have these attractions, but I'm going to submit it to Christ, and I'm going to live my life the way He wants me to live it, not the way I prefer to live it. They're heroes to me.
Yeah.
Heroes.
Yeah.
I want you to think about this just for a moment, and I think it's important for all of us to think about it. If I have a problem, who knows what my addictions might be, or my proclivities might be. Maybe it's greed, maybe it's power, maybe it's pornography, maybe it's looking at women sideways and not thinking about, maybe it's even misogyny, maybe I think of women less.
Wow.
And I recognize that problem within me, and I submit it to Christ. I submit it occasionally to Christ, right? If you're someone who has a deep-seated attraction to someone of the same sex as you, and romantic feelings as well, these two colleagues of mine, they submit that moment by moment, not day by day, not week by week, every waking moment. Those men are heroes to me. Can you imagine what that would be like? And it'd be very tough. So I think a couple of things that we can do as Christians, recognize these are not just icky behaviors. These are things that people feel deeply. We need to actually have friends and witness not only through our words, but also just through our friendships, and have deep and abiding our friendships with people with whom we very much don't agree.
Right.
But it can value them as people. So when that young lady comes with a microphone, and you think to yourself, what am I going to say to her? I think the first thing I was hoping to do was to validate her.
Yeah.
One is to say this: I know she's probably been on the receiving end of harsh comments, of sideways looks, of whatever it was from people who claim to follow Christ. And the last person who should ever say you're morally less than me is a Christian who recognizes their moral depravity before God and needs that salvation. My colleague Sam Alberry, again, one who actually struggles with same-sex attractions, has said over and over again, every one of us is broken in every way. It's not that you're sinning just like I'm sinning, your sexuality is a sin like my greed is a sin. Everything is broken about us, but we're made in God's image. So I think that the key here, when we're interacting with people and when these issues come up, and I hope they do come up, it's to, I think, dispel this idea that the Bible is this homophobic book that written by dusty old men who just find certain behaviors gross.
Right.
and arbitrarily say, don't do that, and I don't want you to, and I'm going to have God say, not do that. Why does the Bible say what it says? This is a key. One of the things I try to point out, and I explain it in a lot more detail in the book, is Christians need to stop being pro-institution, like pro-institution of marriage and all these things. I'm pro-institution of marriage.
Certainly.
But we need to start being pro-people. And the reason why the Bible actually has strictures on sexual behavior, mandating it between a man and a woman within the bonds of marriage. Why does it say that? It's not arbitrary. There's actually beautiful reasons. One is that people are made in God's image, and so them being sacred, the process by which they come about itself is sacred, and that which is sacred, sexuality, needs protection, and so it requires boundaries and borders. It's got a purpose to it. So that's one. Number two is that being a sacred being, God has given us the privilege of reflecting the divine splendor. In fact, when the Bible describes Adam and Eve first having the ability to conceive a child, it talks about Adam knowing his wife.
Yes.
And then later on, we have these you see it over and over again in the Bible, where people don't have sex with their wives, they know their wife. You know someone through and through. And God is the seat of all knowledge. So when you engage in the sexual activity, you're reflecting the divine in terms of the idea of knowledge, but you're also reflecting the unity of diversity of God in a Trinity. He is a unified diversity. That's why the Bible says the two shall become one flesh. That word in one in Hebrew is echad. Echad means unified. It doesn't mean one numerically. It means unified. Oh. So we get the privilege of reflecting the divine in that. And of course, that's a unity of diversity all by itself, but then the ultimate unity of diversity is the marriage between God and his church, once temporal, defiled, and dirty, who he's cleaned up and is now made glorious, to the one who is never any of those things, a unity of diversity once again. So we have to respond by saying, here's why I believe what I believe. It's not just, that's gross, don't do it. It's, God wants this for you. You can take it or leave it, but this is why the Bible says what it says. And I can tell you this over and over again. I've seen people respond to it. And one of the reasons they respond to it is for the starting point. They've often heard Christians, I think, denigrate their value, as opposed to saying, you are a child of God made in his image. You gloriously reflect something. And that is a uniquely Christian thing to say.
Wow. Abdu, I'm so passionate about wholeness, and I really believe that it's never too late for people to step into, grow into a place of wholeness. And one of the things I think is such an encumbrance to walking in wholeness is shame. And I think in a lot of people, especially in today's culture, shame manifests in self-protection and self-promotion. And so what I'd love to know is, how do we create safe places? This generation questions everything. How do we create safe places for this generation to question things like this and to enter into conversation without shame infiltrating the conversation?
That's an excellent question, and one the church needs to take seriously. It used to be the case where, for example, you're a woman caught in adultery. Of course, you're brought before Jesus. Yep. And he knows what the law says, but he looks at her and says, I don't judge you, now go and sin no more. How do you have that kind of thing in our churches or in our Christian communities? It doesn't have to be at a church. You can take church with you, to a coffee shop, to the grocery store, to your living room. To create the safe space, I mean, think about this. Shouldn't the church be the safest space in the world to go to when you're struggling with something? Let's say you've been in church your whole life, but ever since you can remember, you've had attraction towards people of the same sex, and you haven't told anybody, and the reason is you fear being kicked out.
Yeah.
I find that tragic. It's one thing to be defiant, but it's another thing to be questioning. The church should be the place where you can come with your questions and your tough struggles and confide in someone. So I think one of the things the church can do is to actually have inviting places where you can tell them, we're not going to come to agreement. I'm not here to validate everything about you, but I am here to validate you as someone who struggles with these things. I think that's an important part of what it means to be a church, is to have these places where you can do that. I'll tell you this, my own kids, none of these issues come up in terms of their own questions, whether it's none of the sexual identity stuff comes up at all. Of course, issues like this come up because they're growing children and they got to figure out their place in the world, and part of That includes the morality of different things. Early on, I told my kids, and I'm glad that they've actually taken me up on this. I told them, any question you ask me will always be met with listening ears.
Yeah.
I will listen, hopefully more than I speak. But when I do speak, and it might go on, I'm your dad, it might go on for a while, and you might roll your eyes and say, is he gonna be done one day? But every question will be validated, because I might not tell you what you want to hear, but I'm going to tell you what you need to hear. But I'm going to do it lovingly, because I don't want you asking anywhere else but here first. You can get information from outside places, but the place you're going to receive the most pastoring, the most care, the most compassion, even, and maybe even especially when we disagree, will be at home.
Yes.
Why can't the church do that? It's tough, because you have other opinions and other people in the mix and all these things. But I think that's an important thing for the church to do. And not just on the sexuality issues, on everything, on everything. When John the Baptist came to Jesus with doubts, he was in prison, and he says, are you the one to come, or should we look for another? Jesus doesn't smack him down and say, how dare you doubt, how dare you question? He said to John's servants, he says, go back and tell him the good news is preached to the poor, that the deaf hear and the blind see and the dead are raised. He says, go back and give him the evidence. He has questions, go back and give him the evidence.
Yes.
We should welcome people who have doubts, because if we don't, they stop being skeptics and they start being cynics. And we don't want to turn people into cynics.
Right.
We want to take skeptics and answer their questions.
It's really good. And we've not explicitly said this, but I think we've definitely been around the center of this topic. While there are guiding principles to truth, we're talking about the person who is truth himself, and that's
Indeed.
Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just emphasize that and create a platform by which the rest of this conversation is going to be had, to say that Jesus is the center, Jesus is the foundation, who is truth himself, and so that's the center upon which we're having this conversation.
And this goes back to the idea of preferences and autonomy as well.
Right.
Because I think the center issue for the culture is self-deification,
Yes.
to make ourselves God by making ourselves fully autonomous. And autonomy comes from two Greek words, autos meaning self, nomos meaning law. You are a law unto yourself. Essentially, you're God. Mm-hmm. Which is, by the way, Adam and Eve's problem. They were submitting to God's will and to the truth that God had laid out, but then their preferences to be God superseded their purpose to be with God. Yeah. Which is why Satan was so easily able to deceive them. And we've been living in that ever since. That seed of the post-truth culture was planted in the garden long ago, and now it's a big tree with lots of flowers and lots of fruit, unfortunately. So what I would say is that Jesus says, and you read John chapter 8, verse 31 to 36, and you see these amazing, it's one of the most amazing conversations he has, because it's he's talking to people who believe in him. Mm-hmm. And he says to them, if you abide in my word, you will truly be my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Know, truth, freedom. He makes a coupling. Yes. Truth and freedom are always linked together, never separated. Autonomy can never lead to freedom. Truth has to lead to freedom, and truth has boundaries. It excludes falsehood, for example. So it always has boundaries. So Jesus links truth and freedom, but then he goes on to say, because the people respond to him and say, how can you say we're not free? We're children of Abraham. We've never been enslaved to anyone, which I find to be hysterical, because children of Abraham never enslaved to anyone. Did you forget the 400 years of captivity in Egypt? You celebrate your liberation from it every year on Passover. And yet in this conversation, because of their preferences, to be autonomous and free, they're willing to ignore history. Oh. Again, feelings matter more than facts. And Jesus lovingly responds back to them so profoundly when he says that if you are a slave to sin, you are a slave. Yeah. But the son does not remain in the house remains in the house forever. The slave does not. He said, so if the son sets you free, you are free indeed. You see the two couplings now. Truth sets you free. Powerful. The Son sets you free. The Son is the truth. He literally claimed to be the truth. We were at Yale University, and a young man at the end of the open forum asked a question. He says, I see how you're talking about resurrection being true, of Jesus, and truth is important. But you made this message about like the Son and Jesus himself being the truth that leads us to freedom. Can you put all that together? And I remember thinking to myself, what a profoundly good question.
Yes.
When Jesus says the Son sets you free and you'll be free indeed, what does he mean? And the answer is this. Historically, well, let's just put it this way, existentially, we're sinners.
Yes.
And we know this. No one has to delve too deeply into their own past to recognize they're sinners. We were made in God's image to have a relationship with him, but we destroyed that by that opportunity by sinning and wanting to be God himself instead of being with God. But Jesus comes and says, I can fix all that by paying the debt you have to pay and then rising from the dead to prove I was right. Because if he died and stayed dead, how would you know he was right? You wouldn't know he was right. He says, I'm paying the debt for you. Well, okay, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but he rose from the dead to prove he was right. So I think what you get from the crucifixion and resurrection is this. Jesus claims to be the perfect one who satisfies God's justice and his mercy at the same time, so that our relationship with God, our very purpose for being, can be restored. So what does that mean? That we are truly free. What is truly free? It's not doing whatever you want, whenever you want, and whatever way you want. That's chaos. True freedom is doing what you want in accordance with what you should, based on what you are.
That's good.
And those are the boundaries of freedom. And Jesus says, you are made in God's image, and you should act in accordance with that. And when you realize that, you'll do what you want, which is to glorify God.
I'm seeing it so much in culture today, and I want to just kind of apply everything we're talking about today to something that happened recently in culture. And last week, Kanye West tweeted about his love for President Trump and essentially saying, I love him. And he went on to write this, quote, I'm not scared anymore. I'm not scared of the media. With love, I am invincible. Here it is, Abdu. Truth is subjective, but love is the most powerful force in the world, and the world needs to express more of it, end quote. I'd love to know your thoughts, not on what he said, but why he said it and why it triggered so many people. So applying our conversation today, what's being triggered in society to say, number one, he just broke some major cultural barriers.
Yeah.
Number two, he is celebrating someone that a lot of people do not celebrate or support, despite his leadership in our country. And I guess I'd just love to know, why did it trigger people? Why are people being so triggered on these issues?
Yeah, and so this goes back to the whole Hitlerization of social commentary thing, is that if you don't say what I like, I'm going to be mad at you. By the way, and this is just a truism of life, and I've been experienced it so much, the Hitlerization is something that affects everybody.
Yeah.
If you're on the left, only the right tells lies. If you're on the right, only the left tells lies. If you're a centrist, only the right and the left tell lies.
Yeah.
We never self-reflect on these things. So I think one of these things this is triggered, without getting into the politics of it whatsoever.
Of course, right.
But one of the things this is triggered is a bit of self-reflection, because he uses this word love quite a bit, and I agree that love is the most powerful thing in the world. That's why, because God himself is love. Mm-hmm. In order to make that statement, by the way, you can't say it in a vacuum. Correct. Love is the most powerful thing. Well, not to amoeba, and not to the H1N1 virus, and not to buffalo. Something about us is special that recognizes this reality of love, because we are made in God's image, who himself is love. So that statement doesn't make any sense outside of a Christian context. That's what I would say. And I realize people want to use that, but I think that doesn't make any sense. I'm not even sure where he sits on those things. But the phrase I want to sort of latch onto is this truth is subjective thing.
Yes.
I think this is exactly why the book is important to be important, and why I wrote it in the first place. But for all of us to come to this idea that truth is subjective is a statement that can't be subjectively true. It's got to be objectively true. And if it's objectively true, then truth is not subjective. So you react to these kind of things, and people react on various issues. People who are surprised by what he says in a positive way make him a hero. People who are surprised by what he says in a negative way make him out to be a villain. And so again, polarization, because we've lost our sense of accountability and human value. Yeah. Instead, why don't we engage? We can disagree adamantly about these things, But if the truth is not subjective, then we have nothing to fear because the truth will be our guide.
That's good.
And we won't engage in these, well, hopefully we won't engage in these wars, whether it's Twitter wars or whatever it happens to be. We won't engage in these things. We'll simply be able to disagree agreeably.
Yeah.
And then maybe we'll come to some consensus at some point. Os Guinness made the statement. It was such a good statement. He said, we're no longer considered injustice. We're fascinated with just us. And that's a lot of us. And that's, frankly, in some senses, it's all of us.
Yeah.
So I think that we need to, have a little bit more charity in how we respond to people. I think we need to have a little more of this love, which is the most powerful force in terms of our response to people. St. Augustine said it so long ago. In the essential truths of life, we have to have unity. In non-essentials, we have to have liberty. But in all things, we have to have charity.
Yeah.
So if we have charity one to the other on our disagreements, I think the global public square, as Os Guinness puts it, will be a real place again, where we can have public dialogue, where we don't have to excoriate someone and kick them out of the public square. Because it stops being a global public square and starts being the Roman Colosseum. And that's what we're doing now.
Yes.
We can't afford to do that, especially now with all the world scene happening. We simply can't afford to be a Roman Colosseum. We need to be the global public square once again.
That's good. Landing the plane, literally just have a couple minutes left in our conversation. Your brand new book, Saving Truth, is right now available everywhere books are sold. We want to encourage everyone to go pick up a copy. What would you encourage us? How would you encourage us to put this message to action in our daily lives as we close today?
I'd say the first thing to do is to take seriously anything in the book that is self-reflective, is to point inwardly once again, and then use what's in this book, as you so well put it, not to weaponize it in terms of how do I stand up to the culture of confusion and defy it. You know, lighthouses don't exist to defy the ships in the fog. Lighthouses exist to point the ships. Even a lone small light can stand up and say, this is the right path, to avoid the crashing. We need to be lighthouses, little lighthouses amidst the fog that can shine a light and I think show the culture the way to go. I think self-reflection, and then use it in a way that's cheerful and hopeful. 1 Peter 3:15 says to provide a reason for the hope you have within you to anyone who asks. So I would ask this of Christians listening. Do you live a life in hopeless times? Do you live a life so hopeful that people ask, what's with you? And do you express it with gentleness and with respect? That is the key. Hopefully people will walk away seeing the sun through the fog and the hope of the gospel. I hope that it provides clarity coupled with compassion.
Wow. Folks, he is Abdu Murray. He's the author of the brand new book, Saving Truth, available right now everywhere books are sold. Abdu, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
Really
thanks so much.
it.
It was a great pleasure.